Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Homi Gandhi, and I'm currently the Vice President of FASANA. Many of you know probably, or many of you don't. FASANA is Federation of Zoroastrian Associations of North America. It has 26 associations and 11 small groups under the umbrella of the Federation. Today, we are going to listen to a very interesting dialogue from CRDC, NIAC, and University of Maryland professors. The interesting part of this is, as a part of the three sponsors, I'm welcoming you today to this very interesting part of the lecture and panel discussions. This is a unique time for both Iranian traditions and Jewish traditions, because we just celebrated Iranian New Year, Nowruz, and we are celebrating Passover. So we'll be listening to interesting conversations. And on behalf of CRDC, NIAC, and FASANA, I welcome you all. Speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. My name is Sridhar Parsi. I'm the president of the National Iranian American Council. Delighted that you all are here. We're a little bit sorry that we had to start a little bit late, but we had a completely full RSVP list, and we know that because of traffic, as was mentioned, we're delighted to do this program together with CRDC, as FASANA, NIAC, to bring together a conversation that hopefully will be a very different conversation than we're constantly hearing in the media right now. I think right now, if you turn on the TVs, you hear nothing but, pretty much negative news, and we're oftentimes left with the impression that those who have access to speak using mass media are only using a language that's furthering the divide that appears to exist between the Jewish people and the Iranian people. And I think, unfortunately, those who seem to be fearing peace more so than they fear war are in command of the conversation. I think part of the effort with this event is to change the conversation to a conversation that actually doesn't permit all of that negativity to consume our consciousness, but instead lets us realize the tremendous connections, bonds, historical ones that exist between the two people. And the timing could really not be better, particularly mindful of not only Nowruz and Passover, but also the fact that we are here in this city right now. We have the great pleasure of having Cyrus's Cylinder, and we'll talk more about that, and hopefully everyone get a chance to see it and understand the profound meaning of this rather small stone that has had such a tremendous impact on the history and the development of both of these peoples. I'll stop here and give the word first to Professor Bakhash, who is of course known to everyone at this university, who has a tremendously long history of working on these issues, starting off as a journalist in Iran to a professor in the United States, and a person that I know the decision makers and influencers listen to on a very, very regular basis.
Thank you. Well, as a historian, I will begin by talking about the history of the Cyrus Cylinder. Over the last 2 or 3 weeks, at various events very much like this one, marking the exhibition of the Cyrus Cylinder at the Sackler Museum in Washington, I have greatly added to my knowledge of the provenance and the resonance of the Cyrus Cylinder from curators, archaeologists, and art historians, and I'm very pleased to be able to share some of this and my own reflections on it with you this evening. The Cyrus Cylinder is no larger than an American football, but it looms large in human history. It marks the initiation of a new model of empire, of rule and not based on oppression, but on freedom from captivity and on respect for the religious beliefs and ways of diverse people. Yes, you have. We're in the wrong, sorry. There, okay. The cylinder celebrates the victory of Cyrus over Babylon in 539 BC, and in it, Cyrus thanks the god Marduk for delivering Babylon to his hands. He proclaims himself as Cyrus, the mighty king, the king of Babylon, the king of the world. But he also announces that he's freeing the captive peoples held in Babylon, allowing them to return to their ancestral homes, permitting them to take with them the gods and temple vessels that the Babylonians had seized, and is also directing them to rebuild their temples and their places of worship. The cylinder does not mention the Jews by name, but the Jews are the best known beneficiaries of this royal order. The Jews were able to end their 50-year Babylonian exile, to return to Jerusalem, and to begin the great task of rebuilding their temple. Cyrus is thus celebrated in the book of Ezra as the deliverer of the Jews, as the king through whom God made possible the rebuilding of the temple. And in a sense, then, Cyrus is seen in the Old Testament as the agent of God's grand plan. Now, Cyrus's empire was the greatest the world had seen, and perhaps the world's first multi-ethnic, multi-religious, and multilingual empire. As the historian Roman Gershman has written, Cyrus brought an end to the kind of conquest that resounded with the cries of the murdered victims and the fires of sacked cities. Rather, he sought to be, as he put it, an upright king, liberating captive peoples, allowing subject peoples to pursue their own religion and their own ways. His message then was a message of religious tolerance, a recognition of religious and linguistic diversity within his realm. And even though there is obviously a bit of self-promotion in the proclamation of the Cyrus Cylinder, historians agree that Cyrus brought a more humane means of governing to the task of governing empire. And that is really one of the reasons why the Cyrus Cylinder has been described as one of the earliest charters of human rights. Not, of course, individual rights, but the rights of communities and peoples. Now, not surprisingly, a document so rich in its implications and meanings has been appropriated by rulers, scholars, and nations for their own purposes. Machiavelli listed Cyrus among the innovative rulers who rose to power through their own abilities and who brought to the world a new order. Of course, Machiavelli, being Machiavelli, was also quick to note that Cyrus, though a benevolent king, understood that a ruler needed power to maintain his rule. In America, Thomas Jefferson kept 2 copies of Xenophon's admiring account of Cyrus, the Cyropedia, in his library, and advised his son to read the book. Jefferson admired Cyrus because he saw in his rule a model of the religious tolerance that the founders in America were seeking to establish here. And Cyrus has also figured prominently in the Jewish historical imagination. Medieval Jewish commentators on the Old Testament identified Cyrus as the redeemer that the book of Isaiah prophesies would destroy the Babylonian kings and liberate the Jews. And Judeo-Persian writers and poets of the early modern period also celebrated Cyrus as a liberator. The 14th century Jewish poet from Shiraz, Shaheen, in a long epic poem, conflated Cyrus with the heroes of the Persian national epic, the Shahnameh, or the Book of Kings. And this poet also conveniently awarded Cyrus a good Jewish mother in the person of Queen Esther. She gave birth, he wrote, to a boy with the face of the sun. And when King George V of England died in 1936, Jewish newspapers in Poland recalled that the Balfour Declaration promising Jewish support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine was issued during King George's reign and compared him to Cyrus the Great. And the memory of Cyrus also has figured prominently in recent Iranian history. And in the celebrations, so we're not getting the right one again, in the celebrations marking the 2,500th year, the 2,500 years of Iranian monarchy held in Iran under the last Shah, a centerpiece of the week-long celebrations was a ceremony at the tomb of Cyrus. You can see, I hope here, yes, the tomb of the arriving participants, and here the king addressing, delivering his address. The Shah, his voice audibly choked with emotion, addressed the great king with the words, Cyrus, sleep in peace, for we are awake. For the Shah, of course, Cyrus was not only the founder of the Persian Empire, but represented a model of a good, just, and widely admired king. Cyrus has even been appropriated by the Islamic Republic. 3 years ago, at the request of the Iranian government, the cylinder of Cyrus was lent by the British Museum for display in Iran. The opening of the exhibition was attended by the Iranian President Ahmadinejad himself, as you will see him here looking at the cylinder. In the dramatic opening ceremony, a covering bearing the colors and emblems of the Iranian flag was slowly lifted to reveal the glass case in which the cylinder was housed. This exhibition attracted an estimated 500,000 viewers. Ahmadinejad sought to link Cyrus with present-day Iran, and with Iran again as the champion of oppressed peoples. But the exhibition served another purpose. It was a thinly disguised attempt to privilege Iran's pre-Islamic past over its Islamic one, an undertaking that the clerical community has regarded with suspicion and disapproval. And the Iranian people, some of them anyway, have also used Cyrus as a means of challenging and perhaps subtly rebuking the clerical hierarchy which dominates the state in Iran today. In recent years, Iranians, as you can see here, have made it a practice to celebrate the Iranian New Year at the tomb of Cyrus. Thus, in Iran today, the cylinder not only marks Cyrus's victory in a battle 2,500 years ago, it plays a role in a very contemporary battle over the meaning of the Iranian past. Now, while the Persian Empire is no more, Iran does remain a country that has successfully woven together many different peoples: Persians, Azeris, Turks, Baluch, Turkomans, Arabs, and also Muslims, Christians, and Jews into a nation with a common Iranian identity. There have been periods when this common identity has been strained, and it is a fact that the integration of these various peoples has not always been perfect or always based on the principle of equality. Nevertheless, the creation of this enduring national identity is an astonishing accomplishment and owes much to the vision and the foundations laid by Cyrus. But history, of course, is full of ironies, and irony is the word that came to my mind as I considered the symbolism of Iran's present President Ahmadinejad and his celebration of the memory of Cyrus and his cylinder. Here we had a president of a fiercely anti-monarchic Islamic republic celebrating the memory of a pagan king. We had the celebration of a king who liberated the Jews by a president who denies the Holocaust and represents a government that regards Israel as an illegitimate state. And we had a government that seeks for Cyrus to identify itself as a defender of oppressed peoples, even as it represses the rights of its own citizens. But perhaps this only underlines that this 2,500-year-old cylinder remains a living thing today. It stands not only as an inspiration for mankind's better instincts, but also as a rebuke to those rulers who, whatever it is they pay lip service to, ignore the principles that Cyrus articulated. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. That was very thoughtful, and I might be quite to the point about how everyone wants a piece of Cyrus. I wonder how many of them truly understand the deep meaning of what he did. Our next speaker is Professor Kishavars, who is heading the Roshan Cultural Center at the University of Maryland. She has written extensively on several topics, and one book in particular I think is absolutely fantastic. It's Yasmin and the Stars. Those of you who have not read it should pick it up. It's a fantastic personal story about growing up Iranian and then continuing to be Iranian in the United States and facing many stereotypes and this constant struggle to be able to dispel those stereotypes.
Thank you very much, Trita. It's a pleasure to be here and to speak to you. When Trita kindly invited me to be on this panel, I thought, how could I contribute to this dialogue between Iranian Jewish people and Iranian non-Jewish people? Being an academic, being someone who has been deeply fascinated by literature and culture, the first thought that came to my mind was that if we kind of scratch a little bit on the surface of politics and the debates that go on in the media, where we reach is where people speak and communicate to each other through their creative, cultural and artistic means of expressing themselves. So I thought the best way maybe to show what is going on in the society within the country that, as Trita mentioned and Professor Bahosh also mentioned, has successfully brought many, many different ethnic people and religious people together, and sometimes more successfully than other times, but nonetheless these people have lived in peace and have created wonderful culture together. So I thought to pick a number of people, in this particular case from the Iranian Jewish community, although it's really very difficult to separate them because they're so immersed in this culture. that they almost feel offended if you want to separate them and put them in a bracket as the Jews of Iran. They're Iranians whose religion happened to be their Jewish religion. And so I'm going to start with a master musician whose influence is going to continue in Iran for many, many centuries to come. Ustad, as a master like that would be called in Iran, Mortaza Neydavood, who was born in a Jewish family in Isfahan in 1900. I'm actually going to come back to Maestro Neydavood at the end because of a personal connection, but for now I'm going to leave that aside. Now, he was born in this Jewish family. His father, Bala Khan, played an important percussion instrument in Persian called tombak, or the tombak. And from very early age, it was clear that Mortaza had a great musical talent. He taught himself to play the tar, which is an string instrument, very difficult to play, actually, one of the hardest to play, because it has a sheepskin covered on the body, and if you don't know how to play it, you're going to tear the skin. So as a 6-year-old, 7-year-old, he taught himself how to play. And the family noticed that, his father being also a musician, so they hired a teacher for him called Ramazan Khan Zul. Of music are all know that an instrumental equal the name of Mirza Hossein Wali, who just basically was a trendsetter. So Mortaza played for a number of years with this teacher, and the teacher, after 2 years, passed him over to his master, said, I'm no longer really fit to be this, 12-year-old's or 10-year-old's teacher. And from that age, he started playing with Mirza Hossein Wali. And after he passed away, he continued with Darwish Khan, who, again, for people who are familiar with Persian music, was a great tar player. Now, he very soon missions about making Persian music something that young people could learn. So in his 30s, he started the thought of establishing a school of music. And he actually did it by the time he was 40. And this is what I'm going to come back to later on. So, and he worked with some other great musicians of his time. A woman vocalist who is a legend, really, in present-day Iran. The Iranian radio invited him to work for a while, continued his own work, and later on, in 1970s, he was invited again to go back. And many of the people who are familiar with the cultural programs of the Iranian radio in music and poetry are familiar with the name of Master Pir Dawood, Neydavood, I'm sorry, because there was a Pir Dawood, Neydavood, through those programs. At the age 77, he migrated with his family to the United States. He always missed Iran. He felt completely separated from his background and cultural origin, and he passed away in 1990. The second person I would like to talk about is a person that every Iranian student in high school knows, and that's Suleiman Hayim or Hayam, because he produced the most used Persian-English dictionary. And he is actually known as the father of the bilingual dictionary in Iran. But he's actually more than that. He was a playwright. The first play he wrote was Yusuf o Zulaykha, Joseph and Potiphar's wife. He later on wrote the story of Esther and Mordechai. He acted in those plays, and he did translation side by side with all of these things. But when I was looking at his schooling, I was fascinated, because at first he went to a Christian missionary school in Iran called Noor, Madrasa Noor, or School Noor. Then he went to the famous Ittihad, or Unity School, which is a great Jewish school. And I remember that some of my family members had kind of put their names on wait lists to get into Etihad School because it was such a high quality school in high school, both middle school and high school. And then at the end, he went to the school which later on became Al-Borz High School, a famous Muslim school. So this person who becomes a great embodiment of Persian, Jewish, non-Jewish, and then learns French, knows Hebrew, English, he's kind of got this synthesis of learning in a society in which all of this becomes available to him, and he's very much loved. I would like to point to that because people have written about him very lovingly, people from different backgrounds, Dariush Haim, Manouchehr Amiri, people from different backgrounds. And I realize that I don't want to go much longer than others, but I would like to share with you one other person. I just came to know the writing of a young woman called Jayran Gahan, who is the fruit of a mixed marriage between a Jewish father and a Muslim mother. And the book she wrote, Zire Aftab Khosh Khiyal Asr, under the afternoon's wishful sun, is a beautiful story of a Jewish woman marrying a Muslim boy and what they go through, the happy and the unhappy, the misunderstandings and prejudices, as well as the good things that happen in the story. And last year she got the Hushang Gol Shiri Award, which is one of the greatest fiction awards in present-day Iran. And I want to end with a little personal memory. When my book Jasmine and Stars came out, I received an email from a person I recognized to be a member of the Jewish community because of his name, Ishaq Shaul. He has actually permitted me to mention him tonight. He wrote to me and said, if you ever come to New York, I want to talk to you. So one time when I was giving a talk in New York, he came. And he told me, I hadn't been around for years, I was afraid of people. I want to go back. I took my wife, Rose, who's American, went back to Iran. And when I was walking through my neighborhood, I came across this little mosque that I had always been afraid of. This young man walked out and said, oh, you must be visitors, because Iranians immediately recognize you if you're visiting the country, even if you try very hard to blend in. So he said, yes, we are visitors. And he said, well, come in, have a cup of tea. And he said, well, you're Jewish. And he said, so what? Come on in. So they went in the first time, went into the mosque, sat there on the carpet, had a cup of tea. It turned out that that young man's mother was a good friend of Ishaq's aunt called Saltanat. Now, Ishaq has all of this in his website, actually. You can just look him up, Ishaq Shaul. But what reminded me of him tonight is that he was a student of Master Nadav Wood. And when he went back and they found out that he was a student of Master Nadav Wood, they invited him to Nadav Wood's house, which is turned into a museum in Iran, because Nadav Wood actually played the entire Persian Radif on cassettes and had a wonderful collection of notations and so forth. So Ishaq went back the next year and played in Nadav Wood's house. And so he invited me to his house and he played for me. And we have bonded ever since. I call him Baba. He's not that much really older than me to be my Baba, but it's just a great feeling way of expressing this bond that we developed through music and literature. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is known to everyone in this room. He's a great friend. Known him for a very long time. Has been at the center of many efforts to create linkages and bonds and friendship. It's Professor Karim Hakak, who used to head the Roshan Center, is now devoting all of his time for research and the richness of Persian literature.
Thank you very much, Trita. Thanks to all the organizations that got together to organize this event. It's a privilege to be sitting next to such luminaries as Dr. Shaul Bakhash, Dr. Fatemeh Keshavarz, and the rest of the panelists. It's interesting. I think I would like to place this little talk as an extension of the previous two talks. From Dr. Bakhash, what I take home, one of the things I take home is a reaffirmation of the fact that in the case of Iran and the Persians, it seems as though the more you get away from political history and get into the cultural history of the country, the more interesting things become and the more positive they become. At this time, and nor through long stretches in its history, has Iran had much in the way of political leadership, political acumen to teach, possibly to other cultures. But by the time you get to the ordinary people, you see a vibrant and vivacious culture, amazingly bubbling and bringing things forth from its depth and offering it to the rest of humanity. So I would like to place this little talk as a way of questioning, and questioning has always been my preferred technique in facing these objects and rituals of the past. This cylinder, what will it tell us? And I think by the time I was in graduate school, and one of the poems I was so very impressed by was Pablo Neruda's The Heights of Machu Picchu, and the way there he questions Machu Picchu and asks it to reveal what is in its depth, the depth of Machu Picchu, the city, the culture, all the rest of it. A few months ago, PAIA, that's P-A-A-I-A, acronym for Public Affairs Alliance of Iranian Americans, which is one civil society organization in this city and in the United States, asked me to post a blurb on their website on the occasion of the journey of the cylinder to the United States. And as usual, the thing that came to my mind was questioning the cylinder. What does it have to tell us? What does it have to teach us? And I invited everyone to ask those questions with this in mind, that, why is it that when Iranians want to take pride in their past, they have to go 2,500 years ago? It's not a very happy situation. But perhaps there's a lesson in that, and perhaps there's no better audience to at least ask this question of than people such as yourselves. I think questioning the past is really what all of us should be doing. Objects, rituals, installations such as Passover and Nowruz installations and so on and so forth. I see in the writing on the cylinder a formulaic text, really. A king invades a city, the king starts bad-mouthing the king previous to him. Nabonidus becomes the George III of this cylinder, if you wish. And the structure is in fact similar to the Declaration of Independence. If you compare it, the Declaration is much more, of course, extended and expanded. But this does begin with a lot of gripes, and as Dr. Bakhash mentioned, blessing the invader, the conqueror, with the greatest of the Assyrian gods, Marduk. And so, by function, it's a foundation deposit. Write-ups like this, inscriptions like this were placed at the bottom of the new building. And of course, all of this is to detract nothing from Cyrus's benevolence. He was a benevolent king. He did bring together 23 nations, and he did allow the Jews even though they remain unnamed, to go back and build their temples. And not only that, he also allowed the other members of the same faith, Jews of Babylon, those who did not, who decided to stay and not to go, to contribute financially to the rebuilding of the destroyed temple in Jerusalem. So I think his benevolence is definitely one lesson that he teaches us through all these many centuries. And yet, he does mention his own noble birth and puts down his predecessor as a person of low birth. Something that in modern times we don't necessarily take pride in. So for those things, I would like us to put this in perspective. To say that it's a human rights document, I beg to differ, and I think it's a stretch. Human rights is a modern concept. And I do not think any of those ancient peoples, the Akkadians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, anyone could understand, comprehend, or practice human rights as we are trying to strive for. Appropriation, yes, of course, happens. This, like so many ancient texts, is layer upon layer of meaning. It harbors those meanings. And of course, when Machiavelli appropriates the verbiage on the cylinder, he takes it in the direction of his own thing. When Thomas Jefferson recommends it to his son, he is looking at, again, benevolently at the part of the text that deals with the liberation of the captives of Babylon. I would like to see how it works that through the ages we have looked with so many positive eyes, so much positive intelligence on this artifact of 2,600 years ago. And I think it bespeaks of a need inside us, inside all of us, to see something of our own aspirations in the past and to project back into the deeds of the past our own ways. For example, Cyropedia. When Xenophon wrote Cyropedia, it was about 200 years after Cyrus had been dead. And of course, he mentions that to this day people speak very highly of Cyrus. And yet, historians of ancient texts tell us that there's not much biography there. There's a lot of fiction, and it's a literary document, to be honest. So, again, while we do celebrate, and we should celebrate, we also have to remain mindful that we are projecting our own values back on these texts. Equally, this object, this cylinder, has become an object in the hands of some of the most unworthy people, two of them being the late Shah of Iran and the present president of Iran. They have no right to touch that text, and they have no right to use it for their own purpose, yet they do. They do, and they do it mercilessly. And so, in what sense do we feel any pride in this object? In what sense do we approach it without hollow pride, if you will? And that would be the kind of question that I would ask. And for Paya, I said, people should look at this object very carefully and ask themselves the question of what happened to the principle of benevolent governance in ancient Iran? Where did it go? How was it disappeared? And by what mechanisms can we work at least towards, if every one of us in their own generations, towards making such benevolence possible again? I think the fascination with it is good, with this object. I would like to see somehow these events, these appropriations, put in their proper contexts. The late Shah of Iran was celebrating a 25th centenary of the Persian Empire and claiming that it was one connected whole through Iranian history, which is not true. There have been many disruptions, many ruptures in that history. And he himself was the second in a dynasty that was ousted a few years after 1971 when he celebrated. And he did not understand anything about what Cyrus stood for, probably, and what it meant for the Jews to be able to go back to their own countries. Compare the garbage that he was speaking at the same time about the Jews. He, the Shah of Iran, Ahmadinejad, is of course really an extension of that. But he too has derogatory remarks, and they're on the YouTube these days. You can watch. Fortunately, everything is out there for us to see. And it was, of course, who said, as Dr. Bakhash mentioned, Cyrus, rest in peace, for we are awake. And a few years later, when the revolutionary movement happened in Iran, one slogan was, Cyrus, get up, crap has hit the fan. Kurosh bidar shud, gandesh dar omad. That's what people were writing on the walls of Tehran. Ahmadinejad is too much of a disgrace to even be discussing, except that there are people who are swayed, who are persuaded by the rhetoric. There are people who want to make of this hollow pride an occasion to celebrate. And I think somehow those of us who have some claim to distinguishing between justified pride and just hollow pride and super-nationalistic zeal, we have to at least separate ourselves. When the Shah said, Cyrus, rest in peace, we are awake, Anwar Sadat at that time was the vice president to Jamal Abdel Nasser, and he had been invited to Iran, and he didn't stop. He didn't come for the celebrations. He stopped at the airport just because of protocol. And he said, on behalf of the 6,000-year-old nation of Egypt, I congratulate you on the 25th century of the Persian Empire. There is this race, there is this imaginary race that because 6,000 is greater than 2,500, therefore, the Egyptians have one up on Iranians. And I would like to see how we can get away from all of this. They say this Iranian and Egyptian were boasting about their past, and the Egyptian says in the latest excavations around the pyramids, they have found little cables of copper, which means we must have had some sort of wiring in the past. And the Iranian says, yeah, they excavated on Persepolis, there was no copper, it must have been wireless. I invite all of you to see this cylinder. I invite all of you to ask some questions. The questions remain yours, but what kinds of questions lend themselves better to an understanding across cultures? What enables us to come together? I was in Israel in 2010, and it's an amazingly impressive setup that state has worked towards. And when you look at those layers, right in the center of Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, you see all those layers of history. And yet, I look at some of the bombings, and I look at some of the settlement building activity and all of that, and I wonder if we have to commit ourselves to those excesses to be proven to be respectful of the Jewish past. So, a thoughtful process of distinguishing between the kernel and the shell is what I'm inviting everyone. This may be a shell that holds a kernel inside, but it remains to be seen. It is for us to determine that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Karim. I think you put it right, to celebrate Cyrus without seeking to strive to emulate the meaning of his actions is hollow at best and quite shameful at worst. Our next speaker, of course, is from this university, Professor Mark Opin, Rabbi Mark Opin, who is Professor of Conflict and Conflict Resolution here, a good friend of the Iranian American community. We have had very fruitful collaboration in the past. Delighted to have you here and to collaborate with you. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Well, I want to thank all of you for coming. I know many of you from before, and I just want to give a certain perspective on this before we move on with the program. I want to go a little bit more deeply into this whole question of the present versus the past, and the question of this of Cyrus, and the question of manhood, really. I think it's in many ways my training is actually in philosophy, and also my main practice is in war prevention and conflict resolution. So in many ways, I have no patience for history anymore. I'm not interested in things from 2,000 years ago, and yet only if it's instructive, only if it's something that has deep relevance. And I think it is interesting that in the Iranian community, there's something from 2,500 years ago that keeps coming up and coming up and coming up. And in the Jewish community, it's the temple from 2,000 years ago. From 2,000 years ago, what happened to the 2,000 years of temples? I mean, it's a little bit slow on on having something glorious. This idea of going back 2,000 years in each community to something glorious is a little bit interesting. There's a kind of implicit trouble with the last 2,000 years. And I think that that's something that we should think about in terms of how communities help each other and face each other's challenges and learn from each other and honor each other at the same time in all of their glorious imperfections. And it is gloriously imperfect to have to go back 2,000 years in two communities to see glorious times. But I want to get to this figure. I personally, as an outsider to the Iranian community, am fascinated by a man who can be loved by Machiavelli and Thomas Jefferson at the same time. That's really a feat. And then and then not to mention the Shah and Ahmadinejad at the same time. And if that's not enough, you go to the museum and they have a big quote from Ben Gurion. Okay, so I'm thinking to myself, anybody who can have Jefferson, Machiavelli, and Ben Gurion and Ahmadinejad all admiring them must have done something right as a man. He must have had something about him that's, because most of us, especially in peace work, are kind of reviled. I mean, we do controversial work. We actually think people should love each other rather than kill each other. And, you have a lot of enemies. And here's this guy. He's a warrior. He conquers half the world. And it's unbelievable what happens to him in Jewish literature, particularly in biblical literature. And I want to go into that because it is a question of what it is to be a man. So much of warfare that we understand today as conflict analysis is what is it to be a man. The history of warfare, it continues in civilization, and one of the remarkable things in the last 50 to 100 years is that because of various changes in human history, there's far, far more women's empowerment that has been called the feminization of power. And as that power goes up, warfare has tended to go down, especially in the last 50 years. And there's a direct correlation. And it's one of the reasons why we do work in international development and in conflict, in the empowerment of women, mothers, children, professionals, in not only in education, but in policing and many other things, because there's a direct correlation. And so it really is a matter of what is a man. Because Koresh as a man was very different than Nebuchadnezzar as a man. And King David as a man. And half the kings in the Bible as a man. And in fact, it's very hard to be a man in Jewish life, by the way, because from the Bible on, men have a heck of a time. It's not just that Jewish women make sure to put them in their place. It's that the Bible itself is like no leader escapes severe criticism. And this is part of the problem in Jewish-Muslim dialogue, by the way, because in Jewish traditional rabbinic life, it's actually a mitzvah to find a sin with everyone, with everybody. You cannot be a perfect man. So Moses had a sin, and Aaron had a sin. There are whole sections of the Talmud that try to find what was Moses' sin. Then you get into dialogue, in Muslim-Jewish dialogue, and you talk about each prophet and what was wrong with them, and people go, oh my God, you can't say that about the prophets. But in Jewish life, you do. And you really cut down. You really cut down. So the Book of Kings is a book of reviling the kings. One king after another. This king reigned for 50 years. He didn't do anything but idolatry. And he died. And then it moves on to the next king. And it's a bit of an exaggeration, but really even King David and King Solomon, the foundations of all the glorious things in the Bible itself, not in later literature, are subject to severe criticism. There's only one exception, and this is really strange, but it is Koresh. Cyrus. Cyrus comes in for praise in the book of Ezra and in the book of Isaiah in a way that no one else does. And this is not Torah. I'm not saying this to be nice to an Iranian audience, okay? I'm saying this literally from a biblical fact. And it's very strange. It's so extraordinary because by the way, he's a servant of the people. But he's a servant, a messenger of God, right? But that's not such a nice term because Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylonia, was also a messenger. And the prophets are very clear. You're a messenger. You're punishing the Jewish people right now because they deserve it. But you're going to get yours too, very soon. And that was the biblical prophecy about Nebuchadnezzar as a messenger of God. But Koresh is seen as the model of what is possible in messianic, prophetic leadership of humanity. He is seen as the salvation of humanity, not just the Jewish people. And it is that foundation, if you look carefully in the literature of the book of Isaiah, the book of Isaiah is not only important to Judaism, it's critical to Christianity. Because it is the basis for the concept of a Messiah that can redeem history. And redeem history not in some mystical, otherworldly sense. Not nice poetry. Not God bless them, the Jewish mystics or Rumi or others, but this is the idea that God can enter into history and make politics better. Make the relationship between rich and poor better. Make justice a functional part of politics. All of that came from the idea that Koresh actually did it. Not for the Jewish people, but for everyone. The idea, and again, I can't test what's in the cylinder. I studied the cylinder when I was there, and I realized it doesn't say the Jews, and there are some problematic elements, but the biblical literature is unmistakable. That this is an absolute answer to the concept of hope in history. The linearity that there is the possibility of political and prophetic hope that politics can change for the better. That all comes from this non-Jewish king called Cyrus. And that becomes the basis of the Christian concept of Messiah and the Muslim concept of Mahdi in history. If the Jews had not come up with that idea of an ideal Messiah, and then the working of that in Christianity, and then the working of that in Islamic theology. So this is big in Western history. And whether or not Cyrus matched up to that in person, that's a separate question. The point is that what was given birth to was the idea that the world could change for the better, not just mystically, not just magically, but politically, in terms of justice, in terms of people being able to worship as they see fit. Now, he didn't give birth to human rights, but human rights is the structural solution to moving beyond kings who happen to be nice. In other words, the human rights agenda of the last 500 years, starting with Grotius and even the Magna Carta, was to say it's great to, thank God, have a king that's sane once in a while, let alone nice. Right? I mean, they got really tired of insane kings in Europe, and they said, okay, let's not wait for a benevolent one who's always going to have a mad son. Let's think about how to institutionalize our safety and security. And they start out with the nobles, they start out with the men, eventually we get to the women, eventually we get to homosexuals, and before you know it, you have universal human rights. Universal human rights is the instantiation of that dream that I believe Cyrus had, and especially as it's instantiated in the biblical books of the Torah. So I want to say also, on that basis, a kind of, there's 25,000 Jews to this day in Iran. It's the biggest community of Jews in the Middle East that's still there, whatever regime is in place, no matter how extreme, no matter how strange a president is. There's 25,000 people there. They haven't been kicked out. And that's very unusual in Jewish history. We're used to moving a lot. Okay, every 100 years in Europe, you had absolutely no right to live anywhere. You were used for usury. You lent and borrowed for the church. And when the peasants got sick and tired of you, the church said you were Satan, and boom, you were kicked out. First England, then France, then Germany. And my ancestors, my name, Gopin, actually comes from England, and then France, and then Germany, and finally Ukraine. And where my grandparents come in Ukraine, there's absolutely nothing left, except a mass grave from the Holocaust. That's it. That's it for Jewish culture. So I want to say to the Iranian people, Mamnun. Thank you. Because despite all of the problematic aspects of Iranian leadership in history, the fact is that there's some remnant that was saved in the cultural pluralism that has allowed for an exceptionalism to this tiny little minority that now happens to have a state and 400 nuclear weapons and has other set of problems, but a people that for 2,000 years have been very, very vulnerable. And it can only come to Mamnun. And the key in our religious literature and wisdom literature is that the key to salvation and transformation of relationship is repentance, apology, forgiveness, and gratitude. These are the major elements of spiritual traditions, which the Iranian state and the Jewish state could use a big dose of. Let's face it, in terms of repentance, apology for the past, forgiveness, and gratitude. And we are trying to infuse this city with a little bit more of that spirit, based on very pragmatic arguments, very political arguments, but in essence, that spirit. And the day will come when the New York Times, when they say experts say war is inevitable, it won't be just one think tank in town that's always the expert. It may actually be experts in the capacity to build peace between civilizations who also become the experts for the New York Times and the Washington Post. And that's kind of what we're looking forward to. So again, thank you for coming, and happy Passover and happy Nowruz.
I could say a couple of words before we wrap up and move on to the next segment. I have a dream that next time you hear that there's going to be a segment on CNN, perhaps also Fox, let's be kind, and they're going to talk about Israel and Iran, you will automatically think that there could possibly not be anything else that they could be talking about except exactly what you just heard right here. About a deep history of commonality, mutual empowerment, and that the last decades are truly remembered, if remembered at all, as a parenthesis in a very, very long history that has been more often than not been characterized by quite positive things. I want to ask every Iranian, let me do this. I want to ask every non-Iranian in the audience to take the opportunity before the Cyrus Cylinder moves on to other cities to visit it. I'm not going to ask every Iranian to do so because I'm expecting you to do so, and if you haven't done it already, we need to talk afterwards. But what I would like to ask every Iranian in the audience is to make sure that you take this as an opportunity to reach out to both American and Jewish friends and bring them there, because we are all indebted to what Cyrus did, whether it is because of the contribution and the thinking that gave birth to the Constitution, or to the freeing of the Jewish people and the long history of tolerance that has existed in his spirit, or to the very defining of Iran's history itself. And I think it would be a very good thing to do in order to empower more people, that next time you hear about all of the negativity or all of these divisive arguments and the thinking that has only given birth to more conflicts and deepening existing conflicts, that everyone is equipped with an answer to remember that there has been a different past. And if there's been a different past, there can also be a different presence and a different future. And we don't have a better opportunity to do that than right now when Cyrus Cylinder, the actual cylinder itself, is here in town. On that note, I think we're going over to Q&A. Is that correct?